Welcome to the Hobby Hour. I'm Jim Granado, Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. And joining me today is Professor John Aldrich, renowned political scientist. We're going to discuss political parties and polarization. Topics are quite relevant today. Now, before I read John's bio, if I did comment on all the things he's done, this wouldn't be called the Hobby Hour, it'd be called the Hobby 6 Hours. So I'm going to keep this short. First, John is the Pfizer Pratt University Professor of Political Science at Duke University. His research specialties include American politics and political parties, political behavior, formal theory, and methodology. John Aldrich is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received grants from the National Science Foundation and National Endowment for the Humanities. He has been president of the American Political Science Association, Midwest Political Science Association, and Southern Political Science Association. He has authored and co-authored several books on political parties and elections found in course curricula across the country, including the books Why Parties and Change and Continuity. His examination of profound changes in political parties since World War II and the driving force behind the increase in polarization has prompted conversations about how the political divide affects governance today. And as a point of personal privilege, he's my mentor and my friend. So it's just a double pleasure for me. So John, let's start with you. So why did you get interested in the study of politics?
Okay, so thank you so much for having me to do this. One personal thing, Jim is not only one of my students and one of my best friends. He's also really good friends with all the family, including my son, whom he taught how to do noogies and all that kind of stuff. So I went to a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, Allegheny College. I was interested in science, and the science department that I was interested in, biology, was not particularly good. The political science department there was unusually good. It was one of the best small liberal arts political science places in the country. And I got interested in it intellectually. I was not interested in it at the time, and it took me a long time to develop any real interest in actual politics. I was interested in it as an intellectual exercise for the longest time.
So while in college, you decided to go to graduate school. Why?
Several reasons. I was sort of uncertain as to exactly what I wanted to do, but then my experience at Allegheny was so great that I decided I would like to be like one of my mentors as an undergraduate and become a faculty member. And the way to do that was to go to graduate school. So I did that, and I ended up going to the University of Rochester, which at that time had a brand new PhD program. It had been founded it had been founded 6 years, so 5 years of students in the graduate program when I got there. I think I was the 5th class. So it was brand new, exciting, hiring new faculty, bringing in new graduate students. It was a very intellectually exciting place to be, and it shaped my career a lot.
I mean, Rochester too, you can expound on this, please. Rochester was an innovator in how to study politics too, correct?
Yes. There's the branch of political science that was created at the University of Rochester was more or less how economic reasoning, particularly microeconomic reasoning, preferences and choice and strategy could be applied to politics. It was the first place in the country to do this systematically at all. And a man named William Riker founded this department on that basis. It was an absolutely new thing. It took a long time. When I was an undergraduate, my chief mentor, a guy named John Kessel, who was a very very important political scientist himself, said about the University of Rochester and my going there. He said, 10 years from now, you'll be walking down the halls of an APSA meeting. There's a risk that people will say, there goes one of those. And it was true. They did.
But it was also a very positive thing too.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, there they are, but God, they're changing how we study the discipline. And of course it's influenced so many things we do now. I mean, my God.
Yeah, the
So
Public Choice Society,
yep.
The stuff you study was made possible in large part by what William Riker established at Rochester. Yep. The other thing that made it really different was there were very few faculty to be able to teach this to graduate students, and so there was a much greater sense of the graduate students working together to learn this stuff along with the faculty. And so it kind of empowered us to become, actively engaged in the discipline from the very beginning.
I mean, in William Riker was I'll use the word instigator, right? He was the founder. And so but what's interesting about his career is that he was actually a political philosopher before he moved into this form of analysis, correct?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the only required course at the University of Rochester's PhD program was a course in political philosophy. I mean, everybody knew you had to take other courses, in particular game theory and that sort of thing. But that was the required course. It's fundamental. One time I said something in a class, and in typical fashion, it was about a Platonic dialogue in a Riker class. And in typical Riker fashion, he went, Mr. Aldrich. And he got up, went out, brought in his Platonic Dialogues, which was a book that couldn't get wedged shut because it had yellow paper stuck in there. Opened it up, made me read the dialogue aloud to the class, and then said, you see your mistake?
So while you're at the University of Rochester, there's something called the Vietnam War going on. And at that time, students could get deferment, stay in school, correct?
Yes.
And you could have done that, but you chose to serve. Why?
Yes, well, sort of. So I grew up in a small town in the northernmost edge of Appalachia, that is, in the soft coal mining region. And we probably had more guys at my graduating class went directly into the Army or the Marines or whatever than that went to college by a lot. And it was just part of, that was just life, ordinary stuff. And I did have a deferment for the years of college. There was really only one semester where the graduate school didn't give you deferment, and I was drafted at that point. Okay. I had lots of options given to me. I could go to Canada, that sort of stuff, and avoid the draft. But it never occurred to me that ordinary kids were going into getting drafted. I was just an ordinary kid. I should serve my country.
And I think you said you had $1 million injury. Is that correct? One time you told me that.
So when I got drafted, Riker made sure I had a master's degree. And so, drill sergeants had no idea what to do with a guy with a master's degree. It was a private private. And so they assigned me to the obvious place, infantry. And I went to Vietnam and served in the infantry. And it was it was not a war that worked out all that well, shall we say. My job was called assistant machine gun ammo bearer, which means that I carried extra machine gun ammunition. So the weight of stuff on my shoulders was about 110 pounds. I weighed about 145 at the time. And it bruised my nerves. My arms didn't work for like 4 months. And so they pulled me out because I couldn't do anything because I couldn't lift my arms, either one of them. And at that time, my unit got into a very terrible situation, and just about all of them were killed. Yeah. It wasn't one of a, yeah. And I think of, most of the rest of my life, I tend to think of, I was given these years that almost nobody else was given, among my units. And so I feel sort of a responsibility to them. I look at, pictures I had of them and stuff regularly and remind myself that I'm their, I'm carrying forward their legacy.
Right. Let's talk about parties.
Oh, it's getting worse. Let's talk about getting shot at in Vietnam.
In your book, Why Parties, you examine the foundations of the American party system. It's become a central reading for anyone waiting to understand the role of political parties in democracies. I'm sorry, wanting to understand, not waiting. What are political parties and how have they transformed over time?
Yeah. So let me start just make a note at the beginning when we established our democracy. It was the first large-scale Republican democracy, that is, an electoral democracy that elects a Congress or a parliament in the world, and no one knew how to run it. It hadn't been ever been quite done, and they discovered after they created it almost immediately that they needed to organize. And Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on the other side, Adams and Hamilton on one side, Jefferson and Madison on the other, trying to organize to get stuff done in Congress, tried to organize to make sure that their people were elected. And it was the very beginning of political parties. And this idea that you needed to have some kind of organization to be able to achieve collective outcomes, to be able to pass legislation, run elections, has become a fundamental force across democracies everywhere, basically everywhere they've ever been tried.
And one thing, so Federalist number 10 talks about factions. Is that code for political parties too, besides interest groups and things like that?
So originally, when Madison was writing this, he wrote this before the revolution. He was working on Federalist number 10 on his own for different reasons. I mean, for just trying to understand what they were trying to accomplish in the revolution. And factions at the time, we were fighting the British to get independence from the British. British had a king. The king was supposed to reign because of the divine right of kings. God had picked, George III to be king. And so anybody who opposed him would be opposing God's selection. And so opposition was negative and it was treasonous. Whereas in the United States, the whole point was to embed the opposition within the government and allow the forces to debate among themselves as to what direction to go. So faction was in the transition, Madison's transition from something that was really negative, and it retains a negative sense today, into something that was, if not positive, at least functional for the working of democracy. And it became a political party, which in the United States has always been much broader than any single faction.
Right. And the first political parties in the United States were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, correct? Then we had Democrat, Republican too at some point. But could you go through the first parties in the United States?
Yeah. So so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, sometimes called the Hamiltonians. The Federalists are sometimes called the Hamiltonians because he was the central figure in organizing, and Anti-Federalists or Jeffersonians were the other party, and they formed over. So they had agreed. Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, they had all worked together to write this new constitution, to create the new government, but they disagreed as to how big and important the federal government should be. They all thought it needed to be bigger than it was under the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, but they split over how much farther to go. Hamiltonians, the Federalists wanting the federal government, as the central government was then referred to be more important. The anti-federalists saying, not to overdo it, to retain power within the states as well as in the federal government. So that was the beginnings, and it began to spread until the turn of the 19th century, 1800, when Jefferson was elected. And it was divisive enough that his inaugural address included the famous lines, "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans," which was what he called their party, to emphasize the unity between the two, even though they were divided over who should be elected president and what policies they should pursue. And he kind of won and sort of drove out the Hamiltonians of the Federalists, and they began to wane. And it wasn't until the growth of the country and the coming, the build up to the Civil War that we got the Republican Party to form, mostly over issues that would keep the North united, because by that point the North itself, that is the non-Confederate states, could form a majority on its own and didn't need the South to support their party the way it had been in earlier years, when parties were generally coalitions that included both North and South together in both parties.
You mentioned the Republican Party. So the evolution of political parties in the United States between, say, 1800 and 1850 it's the Democrat, what we call the Democrat Party, correct? And the Whigs. And I remember something like Know Nothing. I forget the other. There were a couple others, but very small. But basically, the Republicans replaced the Whigs. Is that correct?
So yes, yeah. So what became the Democratic Party, which was the Jeffersonian Party, right. And at the time, to be called Democratic was to be at Jefferson's time. To be called Democratic was a bad word, and so that's why they chose Republican or Republican Democratic Party. It was kind of cumbersome. When Andrew Jackson was elected president in the late 1820s, early 1830s, he was the first populist, the first person of the common man, and embraced the Democratic Party. Because they were appealing to the Democratic electorate. They had basically driven out the Federalists as an effective force against them. And so a party formed called the Whig Party, which was basically the relatively rich parts of the South, so centered in Charleston, Richmond, and the North, in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. Whereas the Democratic Party had become the party of the frontier, kind of, because the common man was moving west to establish themselves. So that was the division. Whig Party fell apart over slavery. Slavery was becoming harder and harder to keep North and South together. And so they split up. Whig Party itself split over slavery, couldn't agree on nominees, couldn't agree to have a policy platform. And so in this void, two parties, the Republican Party, which was the party of free land, free soil, free men, and free labor, free soil, and free men, and the American Party, which was the anti-immigrant party, contested to become the second major party. The Republicans eventually dominated the Americans and thus became the second party, because they united the North and were unconcerned about the South. That kind of pushed the Democrats to build their most solid base in the South, as well as where else they could outside of it. And that led up to the Civil War and put the Republicans in sort of charge of the country, because the central Democratic part, the South, had seceded.
Right. The parties actually, think about moving through the 1800s, late 1800s, the issues that they supported change over time, correct? I mean, you see in terms of economic policy, I mean, you see very different. I mean, for example, I believe, you can correct me, in the early 1900s or late 1800s, Republican Party was very protectionist, and then that evolved 80 years later where they were less protectionist. Now, of course, now they're moving more in that direction again when President Trump was in office. But do you see a lot of issues where they have shifted over time so they don't look exactly what they used to look like? And what's the basis? Is it circumstance, or is it some intervention? Is there some person that just remakes everything?
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't say they just changed it a little bit. They have flipped almost 180 degrees from, let's say, 1900 to about 2000 and beyond, and that is to now. The Republican Party was, of course, the party of Lincoln. It was the party of the North. It was the party of anti-slave party. It was the protectionist party because the Industrial Revolution was there, and they wanted protection so that Andrew Carnegie and so on could build competitive, internationally competitive steel industries and that sort of thing. The South, the Democrats, were the party of slavery, and then the party of Jim Crow. But they were also in favor of international trade because their wealth came from selling cotton to England, basically, which was the greatest source of income after the end, during and after the end of slavery. So that and it's tilted almost exactly 180 degrees. There were a couple of key moments. It is important that a person comes along who's able to lead into these changes, but it's also a base upon which these changes can be made. So Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression, being elected as the guy who could balance the budget better than Herbert Hoover, becomes the guy who almost immediately puts in the New Deal, which was Keynesian spending to try to jumpstart the economy. It only took 20 years or 30 years or whatever it was to actually get out of the Depression until World War II. But he began to build that, and that was a dramatic change from what the Democratic Party had stood for in the past. So that was one point, and it was because a quarter of the people, a third of the people were unemployed, had nobody working in their household, and a great deal is needed to sort of survive. And it was worse in the South. So the Democratic Party in the South supported this in the early parts of the New Deal because they were by far the most seriously affected by the Depression. The turning point comes really on civil rights in the latter part of the New Deal. Harry Truman integrating the armed forces, and then especially Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, building on that, put the Democratic Party's Southern base at odds with what he was doing. And eventually, especially into the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and because he was such an effective leader on his side, was able to turn and pull the Republican Party into the South and become the dominant party in the South when it had been totally ineffective up through the 1960s. So that was the turning point, and other issues that cement the support that the party needs to win its elections is the source of this evolving. The trade policy, kind of follows all the other changes and is used to help cement the support that the Republican Party, the Democratic Party have and what their constituents need and want.
Parties also can be they fluctuate being the majority and minority party, and alignments affect that. So could you talk a little about that and when we've had those?
Sure. Yeah. So right now we have so here's the oddity of elections in America right now. National elections, let's say Congress. They are extremely closely balanced between Democrats and Republicans. As we've seen, they go back and forth over this millennium so far, in this 25-ish years. It's been very close, and they go back and forth as to who holds. And yet 90% plus of incumbents win re-election. There's a block that you can't move. I refer to it as sort of like World War One. The Democrats have, their Maginot Line, and the Republicans have their Ludendorff line, and they have a battleground in front of them, the no man's land that's about 10% of the electorate, and all the rest is easily safe. But that 10% changes between as to whether the Democrats or the Republicans have the majority. It's very close. The other time we've had a long series of very close elections was the last time the two parties were extremely polarized and far apart, and that's back in the late 19th and early 20th century. In between, the Democrats had a working majority that Republicans in Congress for 40 years never imagined the possibility of even winning a majority for 2 years. And Jerry Ford was basically ready to quit as leader of the Republican minority in Congress when he got selected to be vice president. One of the reasons he agreed to do it is because he could see no future ever becoming Speaker of the House, even though he had been there since the 1950s. So this close competitiveness and the separation, the two parties stand for very different things, has created this sort of World War One like situation, I think.
Let's continue with this discussion. You've talked about Congress. The distance between the parties ideologically, if you measure voting records, has continued to increase since the 1970s. Is that correct?
Yes. Sharpest today after we don't know about what about after the last election, but certainly after 2020, when we have the record of what they did in Congress for 2 years, is the most extreme separation between the two parties. Have
we had other points in time where it's been like this? We have the voting records, so we can actually check. We don't have to worry about the quality of the data, right? So,
yeah.
When we had?
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, in terms of voting, it's back to the same time. It's part of a syndrome, a collection of things. So one of them is the elections are really close. The second is the parties are really broadly separated, trying to parse out a support base they can count on, and these things seem to go hand in hand. And so it was the late part of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century up until the New Deal, and from there on. One of the reasons that there was this gap in the middle, and if you look at how far apart the two parties are in terms of how they vote in Congress, it's a big U shape. Lowest in the middle, because as the New Deal wore on, the Democratic Party in the South began to differ from the Democratic Party in the North and divided. And we almost had a three-party system: Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and Republicans. And the Southern Democrats held the balance of power. They could align with the Northern Democrats when it was something they wanted from the Democratic Party and form a Democratic majority, or they could align with the Republicans and form a so-called conservative majority, mostly to keep civil rights and the Jim Crow system active. And functioning, anti-civil rights and the Jim Crow system. That was sort of the base, but they were also, stronger defense with the Republicans. than the Northern Democrats, but on lots of other issues like helping poor whites be able to, get educated, get training, and so forth. Those kind of social things, they tended to vote with the Northern Democrats on those. That explains why there's a gap in the middle.
Right.
And power in the House went by seniority. And so since there was no Republican opposition in the South, there's no second party in the South. Once you were elected to Congress as a Southern white Democrat, you could count on staying there until you couldn't tell if you're still in Congress anymore. You're so old that you couldn't tell. And so inherently, they just acquired the power that comes from seniority, became Southern Democrats' source of power. Northern Democrats, when they could get the Southern Democrats to work together, had voting power, and those two things together explain sort of why the parties had lower levels of party division and also lower levels of party separation, because the Southern Democrats were acting like moderates, sometimes going to the left, sometimes going to the right, and putting together a package like that.
So people vote, and party identification is very important. But one thing that this raises is, and you're pointing out some things, how closely aligned are most Americans with the political party they're in? Is there a gap? I mean, do we have more extreme members of the parties that are elected now, and even though you're going to stay on your own team and vote the way you're going to vote because you want to be aligned to your political party, but you're going to be scratching your head sometimes and be very upset, but you're going to vote that way anyway. But is there a growing gap there too between the public and the parties?
Yes. Yeah. So as it so happens, my current research project that's starting to reach culmination is precisely on this kind of question. And so one of the key things is that in terms of public policy or ideology, the American electorate has been moderate for a very long time, for as long as we've been able to measure it. Systematic high-quality surveys began in 1952, so that's 70 years now of surveys in which we can measure this really carefully. I was just looking at the data. I could actually show you if I could figure out a way to share screen. But even as late as 1988, as polarization was starting to align, if you look at sort of where people stand on issues, it was like a tent, a V, an upside down V, with the very dead center of the policy having by far, having the plurality of voters and it going down on either side from there to the extremes. If you look at it today, it's like a tent. The highest support is in the middle, and the extremes are less. It's just that the tent pole is a little bit lower, so it's kind of flattened out a little bit, but it's hardly observable that it's much different. And that's kind of true if you ask them about ideology and so forth. And that's when at the same time that the parties are separating. It's the public acts as sort of a ballast. The parties in Congress, in the Senate, in office, generally the guys who run campaigns and all that kind of stuff. One time it swings to the right and the Republicans do well. The next time it swings to the left and the Democrats do well. And the reason is because if you go too far to the right, then the moderates rebel against the moderates in the electorate rebel against that, pulls them back. It swings over. The Democrats overshoot too in office. The electorate pulls them back. So it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. And so the question is, what keeps the parties going to their extreme? And there are at least two answers that are worth noting. The first is the rise in competition for congressional seats or whatever else in primary elections. So you get the right half of the electorate voting in Republican primaries, the left half in Democratic primaries, and so the candidates move out to try to get those people so they get past the primary before the general election. That's one source of it.
And they tend to be a far smaller part of the electorate. So primaries, you can correct me on this, but primaries tend to have far fewer people voting.
Right.
And so there's more likely for extremist, that's not the right word, but more conservative, more liberal people doing the choosing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, by and large, since at least a chunk of the moderates are independents, may be independents who, as we say in the literature, lean towards the Democratic Party or lean towards the Republican Party or lean to no party at all, they're the least likely to vote. So the middle doesn't vote much in primary elections, only the outer edges. And so that's one source. The other source, which has come about, especially since about 2010, is the growth of funding coming from the super PACs, even the political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, their congressional caucuses, their national committees, and so forth, but also super PACs who are unrelated to the parties, spend lots of money, give lots of money to the candidates, provided that they're willing to take positions that would give them the money that makes them able to contest effectively in primary or general election, either one. And so those two sources are relatively new, are functions of the last 40, 50 years, and explain why the candidates, and then since they want to keep winning re-election, they'll become candidates in 2 years from now, why they continue to be more extreme than the general public is. And the only way forward would be to somehow or another empower the electorate as a whole in choosing who the candidates are.
Well, I want to come back to the idea about what we can do. But first, I want to ask you, how do we measure polarization? We've been talking about it. I mean, it's like what Potter Stewart said about pornography. I know it when I see it. I mean, what do you think are some of the best candidates for measuring polarization?
Well, the one that seems to win out, because it appears not only in academic journals, but also in New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and so on, regardless of liberal or conservative tone to it, is something that two political scientists did. One of them is Keith Poole, who I mentioned because he and I were in graduate school together at the University of Rochester, and he is another one of the other few Vietnam vets in the discipline. But anyway, so they invented this procedure that takes all the roll call votes ever cast by Congress and comes up with what is generally considered to be the most useful of the measures of how liberally or how conservatively members of Congress have voted when they were actually in Congress and actually voting. And while you might want to try to explain how they get to be liberal and conservative, and you can't use that to explain itself, it is in some sense for this question of looking at how we compare to our Congress compares to our public, the most useful, because this is how they actually get public policy. They cast these votes. And if you're casting votes for liberal policies, that's or conservative policies, that explains a lot about how liberal or conservative you are. Whatever you are personally, it's how you present yourself to the public. And that's by how you're acting on actual choosing policy. So it's considered the best. There are many problems with it. You can make all kinds of methodological, sort of critiques. But as you do that and you try to correct it, they come out all other measures come out so similarly that this has become essentially the gold standard measure for how liberal and conservative our members of the House and the Senate are. And that's the measure that I was describing, was based on that U shape is really clear in their work. From their measure,
right? And it's called nominate, correct?
Yes.
Yep. That's okay. So folks out there who are interested in looking at this type of data, it's called nominate, and it was Poole and Rosenthal, I believe.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there are. I mean, that's only measuring the output. How they get to the output. People who sort of look deeply into committees and sort of who is pushing which policy inside committees and so forth, they typically don't get very different results than would be in broad measure in Poole Rosenthal nominate scores.
Right. So there's every once in a while we get agitation for a third party. First question is, do you think we need one? And I've got a couple other questions. So this is kind of related, maybe some reform, some possibility to get us out of this ditch. Do you think the country needs a third party?
So the people who are, the sort of academics who are most in favor of this tend to be people who study other nations, because they see other nations have large party system, large numbers of parties, at least 3, which is a big number, a 50% increase for us. Yeah. The problem with it is twofold. One of them is the particular election system we have tends to favor two-party. Single-member districts tend to lead to two-partyism. But the second is that we have 3 electoral systems integrated tightly, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And, the story about the Senate is that there are 100 people who get up in the morning, look at themselves in the mirror and say, I can be president. I should be president. There are 435 members of the House. At least 300 of them get up in the morning and say, I'd really like to be president. I got to get to the Senate first. Right? And so their behavior, and even earlier, most people who go run for Congress, it's very common for them to come from, say, state legislatures, whether it's the Assembly or the Senate or a governor going on to national level office. And it all hooks together so that if you say, I want to run for the state legislature in North Carolina, my home state, and I want to have a career in politics, I have to pick one of those 2 parties and ride them up the ladder of offices and see how high I can go. Can I make it to the White House or not? So that glues together the parties across the many offices. We're unique in the sort of democratic world, especially of the sort of advanced industrial democracies, of how many offices we have elected and how many of them are partisan. And so this says when you're 26 and first running for office, you got to think about where you want to be when you're, 82 and running for re-election for president.
So, but there's another question related to this: is would a multi-party system that is 3 or more really improve governance? I mean, so you have other parties represent, other viewpoints represented, and you got to build coalitions. I mean, so the nature of and of course, the proportional representation system, what we're talking about here, that's newer than what we have, because we have, as you said, single member, winner take all, and so that it's a barrier. We'll talk about Duverger's law in a little bit, but do you see that the policies, and this is it's a squishy question, but I'm a squish, so whatever. Do they make better policy? I mean, are they better fiscally? I mean, are there other things that they do that we don't do as well? I mean, so that's the question, is the policy outcomes. I mean, so you get more people to argue with each other from different viewpoints, but do you get anything better out of it?
Right. So one thing where is almost unquestioned is that you get a better election. More people engage in the election, vote, turnout in a multi-party system than in two-party systems. Even as you think about all the other things that get in the way of that claim, and that's because you're trying to get you have a really decent chance of one of your people who agree with you pretty closely actually making it into office under proportional representation. But we can take the country. I actually studied it for a while for this particular reason. The country that's sort of a democracy, that's sort of the exact electoral opposite, which is Israel. It has, one national district. It has the biggest, most clearly proportional system of any in the world. Along with, there is one or two others that are just that, but you can't be any more proportional than they are. And it's not like things have gone all that well in Israeli politics recently, either. So part of it is our party system differs from their party system in that we have our governing coalition forming before the election, and we present two choices of a governing coalition to the public. They have it formed afterwards, and so they have this whole range of parties, and they've got to negotiate to a governing coalition afterwards. And so it at one level, it doesn't make a difference. If you have a widely diverse and split public, you're going to have a widely split and diverse government. As Jimmy Carter once said, government is good as its people. And these electoral rules that lead to a parliamentary versus our two-party system aren't enough to totally deflect that. But the thing that's really different about parliaments from us is that the Knesset in Israel, that is its equivalent of the House of Representatives, is the entire government. When they pass something, it becomes law. We would have had 47 times or whatever it was appealed Obama if we had a parliamentary Obamacare, if we had a parliamentary system. It's all the power is concentrated there, and once you control it, you control policy making. What you observe is what we're having right now. We have divided government, and so the Republicans have control of one portion of the government, Democrats another, and it's hard enough to govern inside with your own majority, but to have to deal then with the other party's majority makes it really difficult to get stuff done.
Right. So I don't think we've ever had a robust third party, and so the issue is something called Duverger's law, and that's a significant barrier. And would you like to define that for our audience? I mean, go ahead.
Sure. So Maurice Duverger a really weird dude and a really interesting guy. But one of the things he did, he started off as so he was from the extreme left to the extreme right in his career, including a short time as a regular sort of mainstream Democrat, that is small d, supporting democracy. And while he was doing that, he wrote a book called Political Parties. And his basic claim that we remember, there were other things in this book, but the basic claim we remember is that if you have single member winner take all elections, they tend to push you towards a two-party system. That's the law. There's a sort of, he didn't claim it to be a law for a proportional electoral system leading to a multi-party system, but a tendency, a tendance, as they say in France. But the law is precisely the reason it works is that if you ran as a third-party candidate, you would take votes from somebody, and you would hurt their chances, with the chances of you getting all the way up to a majority of yourself on your own very difficult. So let's say a couple examples. In 1912, as I'm sure everybody was thinking about, Woodrow Wilson, a political scientist, by the way, who was the Democratic nominee. The Republican Party split. Teddy Roosevelt, former president, and William Howard Taft, the incumbent president, Republicans. Republicans had a majority, but Taft and Roosevelt had a falling out. Both were strong, well-known personalities. Roosevelt decided to run as a third-party candidate, a bull moose or progressive Republican. So you had three candidates. The Republican Party vote split, and Woodrow Wilson was able to win a majority in the Electoral College with only 42%, I think, of the vote, because it's winner take all. It's not necessarily a majority in each state, but whoever comes in first gets the electoral votes. So that division, if you were a voter, you would say, well, I might like Teddy Roosevelt, but he doesn't stand a chance. I'm going to have to go back to Taft. I don't like him as much, but he's the guy who could win. A more extreme case was in 2000, when Ralph Nader ran as a third-party candidate on the Green Party side, and that's was then and still is a liberal extreme, relatively extreme party, and it was Gore versus George W. Bush. Both of them strong candidates on their own. Really close election. Nader had real difficulty getting any popular following, but he was able to take a significant number of votes, 1 or 2%. And if for those of you who remember Florida, his vote almost certainly would have gone disproportionately to Gore, and Gore would have carried Florida. Gore would have carried probably several other states too. Gore probably the Gore Nader vote was bigger than the W. Bush vote, and so what you should say is, much as I like Ralph Nader, if you like Ralph Nader, I'm going to vote for Gore because he has a chance. Gore's campaign theme on this was a vote for Nader is a vote for Bush, because it would take a vote away from Gore and help Bush. Mm-hmm. Nader's response was, a vote for Gore or Bush is a vote for Gore or Bush. You're going to get one of those two.
So
that's called strategic voting. That's called strategic voting, and it happens because sure, elites know all this. Money tends to go that way. It's hard for a third-party candidate to get money and so forth. But at the bottom line, it's because the way people vote, they think about how their vote is going to affect the outcome, even though it's only one of many millions. If they and people like them vote this way, are they going to hurt the chances of what they think should be the better outcome? called strategic voting.
Right. Right. In terms of reforms, you've identified the super PAC becoming more prominent. I think you said starting in 2010, and there was another. Is there anything you think we can do to help change this, to make it, to try and reduce the polarization, or is there going to be a natural way out of this? I mean, because we've had bouts of this before, maybe not as bad, but it's happened before. Now, I'm hoping the other times we've gotten out wasn't a catastrophe that led us out of this, but are there some rule changes, some legal changes that we could engage in that may help here? Or are you of the view that, well, this will probably correct itself over time?
So there may be some correction over time. That's good. Right now, if you look at the data, the Republican Party is farther away from the sort of the right half of the electorate than I can ever find any party ever being before. So it's vulnerable. That's probably why the red wave that was supposed to happen in 2022, was a trickle instead of a wave. But it may adjust. Candidates may say, "Geez, I can't. I've got to be more in tune with the public because I need their support." That could happen.
Right.
But there are things we can do to make it an electoral system that's more responsive to the wishes of the public, and thereby candidates who will be more responsive to the wishes of the public, and they will look more like the kind of candidates you would expect to arise out of the public. One of them would be to break up the Maginot Line and small battlefield and make the whole electorate more of a battlefield. And that would be to do away with things to the extent possible, like gerrymandering on partisan lines, or indeed on any lines. Almost no other country, democratic country, has a problem with gerrymandering. And that's because they have, all other ones have districting designed by an independent body of some kind or other. It's imperfect. It doesn't work all perfectly, but it's vastly better than what we have. So that's one place to look. A second place to look is to see if you can empower the candidates who are from districts that are behind the Maginot Line, the opposition, so they can run effective campaigns for office. That is actually happening somewhat, and so that's the thing. But the central problem, I think, is that we have an electoral system that says by the Constitution that the elected officials get to design their own electoral rules, and so they're inherently tendency to reinforce themselves. They've had 250 years to figure out how to write election laws that pass the Supreme Court's muster of being constitutional and give them the best advantage they could possibly get.
Right.
And that's true at the congressional level. The Constitution says it's up to the states unless the Congress passes a law. So they can do anything they want to. 19th century, contested elections came to the Congress and they just voted along party lines, and all contested elections went to whoever had the majority.
Right.
So a self-interest, if you say, design a system to get you reelected, after a while, you begin to figure out how to do that. If you take that power away from them somehow, get them to voluntarily take it away.
Right.
That sounds wildly implausible, and it probably is, but it's not entirely so. Consider tax legislation or tariff legislation. Tariff legislation used to be the biggest source of our income as a government.
Right.
And it was a terrible catastrophe from time to time.
Yeah.
When bills would have hundreds of amendments that would change from where you started off the bill to one that rewards every district you could think of.
Yeah, Smoot-Hawley is a great example of that.
Yes.
My God, catastrophe.
Yes. Just ask Ferris Bueller. So if it sticks out to them, it must be. So what they did, in fact, and because of Smoot-Hawley, what the Congress did is they said, we choose to give the presidential administration the power to propose a tariff bill and we can vote either yes or no. No amendments allowed. So they voluntarily, lent that power to the presidency to deal with tariff. And we occasionally have tariff things. Certainly the Trump administration raised that as an issue, but nothing like it was,
right.
Back in the earlier day. So you could imagine a Congress saying, okay, we've screwed up this government long enough. Let's give it to the equivalent of a Federal Reserve Board and a Federal Elections Board with real power, as opposed to a Federal Election Commission, which has none at all. And indeed, I don't think it has enough members to act anymore. So you could imagine reform happening. It's a wild and crazy thing. It's really unlikely. It's one thing to say, okay, we screwed up tariff, but screw up my career? Not in your life.
Well, we're up against the clock, and I just want to thank you for just a wonderful conversation and just getting to see you, of course. So thank you, John. And to our audience, we're grateful for you tuning in, and welcome back to a new season of the Hobby Hour. And stay tuned for more details for the next Hobby Hour in March. And again, John, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. I hope it was worth listening to, and I hope I can help break up the people watching.
Take care.
Okay, take care.